In the small Ohio town where everyone seemed to know everyone else, the Harringtons were often spoken of as the kind of family others could only hope to be. Mike Harrington had grown up there, surrounded by fields of corn and soybeans that seemed to stretch endlessly under the Midwestern sky. He worked long days during the harvest season, operating the combine, coming home with the scent of dust and grain clinging to his clothes. People admired the way he carried himself, steady, hardworking, never the kind of man who wasted his pay at bars or disappeared without explanation. His wife, Ellie, was equally respected. Before the children came along, she had worked as a township clerk, managing records and correspondence for the small town's government office. She had been diligent, precise, and well-liked. But after Vera was born, and then little Johnny 2 years later, Ellie decided to set her career aside. She wanted to be there in the home to raise them. To outsiders, it seemed as though she had stepped gracefully into the role of mother and wife, always put together, always gentle with her children, and unwavering in her support of Mike. Their home wasn't the grandest house in town, but it stood sturdy and warm. It sat on a quiet road that wound between farmland and the cluster of shops that made up the town center. Neighbors often saw Vera chasing after her younger brother in the yard, their laughter carrying across the fence lines. Ellie would be there too, calling them in for supper, her voice soft but firm, the voice of a woman who seemed content. And then there was Dorothy, Mike's mother. Widowed years ago, she had opened her heart completely to Ellie from the very beginning. Where some mothers-in-law might have drawn lines or clung possessively to their sons, Dorothy had only gratitude. She often told her friends that Ellie was like the daughter she never had, kind, respectful, hardworking, and utterly devoted to family. In return, Ellie treated Dorothy as her own mother, leaning on her for advice and involving her in the children's lives. It was not uncommon to see Dorothy sitting on the porch with Vera on her lap while Johnny played at her feet, the kind of multi-generational closeness that made people in town nod approvingly. At church on Sundays or during community gatherings, whispers often circled, admiring, not scandalous. "Ellie is so lucky," women would say to one another. "Mike is solid, not like so many men who forget their vows once the years go on." There was always a tone of envy threaded through their words. Mike not only worked hard, but seemed to cherish his wife. He would bring home small gifts from town, a ribbon for Vera's hair, a toy truck for Johnny, a new dress for Ellie. To outsiders, these gestures looked like proof of an unshakable bond. Evenings in the Harrington household were simple but full of warmth. After supper, Mike would sit with the children, helping Vera with her early reading or letting Johnny climb onto his lap to steer an imaginary tractor across the living room floor. Ellie would watch with quiet pride, sometimes joining in, sometimes just savoring the sight of her family together. Dorothy, never far away, would smile knowingly, grateful that her son had built such a home. Life in the town could be harsh in its gossip, but for the Harringtons, it was nothing but admiration. People compared them to others, men who drank too much, couples who fought loudly, families burdened by scandal. Mike and Ellie seemed to stand apart, the picture of stability. There was comfort in routine, in the rhythm of the seasons, in the knowledge that while crops grew and withered, some things, like love and family, felt unchanging. If Ellie ever worried about the fragility of happiness, she never let it show. Her days revolved around preparing meals, keeping the home, and tending to the children's needs. Vera adored her mother, often trailing her around the house, asking questions, eager to help. Johnny, younger and more rambunctious, clung to her with the trust only a small child can give. To both of them, she was the center of their world. And for Mike, it seemed Ellie was everything. The way he spoke of her in town carried respect. He never raised his voice at her in public, never belittled her as some husbands did. He gave the impression of a man proud of his wife, proud of the life they had built. To those watching from the outside, theirs was a marriage built on trust and quiet devotion, the kind of union that endured. So when people in town said, "Ellie has struck gold with Mike," she only smiled politely. She didn't need to hear it to know what she had. At least, that was what she believed. In the glow of those early years, with 2 children at her side and a husband admired by all, it seemed unthinkable that anything could ever shatter the picture of perfection they had created. Over time, small changes began to creep into the Harrington household, so subtle at first that Ellie tried to dismiss them. Mike, once quick to laugh with the children at the dinner table or share stories from the fields, started to withdraw. He would sit quietly through supper, pushing food around his plate, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the room. When Vera tugged at his sleeve to show him a drawing or when Johnny asked to play, his responses were brief, distracted. In the evenings, instead of lingering with his family, he found excuses to leave. "I've got to check in with a neighbor," he'd say, or "some of the guys are meeting up." At first, Ellie believed him. After all, Mike had always been dependable, the kind of man people trusted. But as the weeks stretched into months, his absences became too frequent, his explanations too thin. Ellie felt it in her bones before she ever heard it in words. The way the air shifted when she entered the room where others were talking, the glances exchanged between women at church, the uncomfortable pauses in conversations that once flowed freely. Something was being kept from her, and the not knowing gnawed at her more than any harsh truth might have. The confirmation came one ordinary morning when she stopped by the general store on Main Street. She had gone early, hoping to choose fabric before the shelves were picked over. Vera and Johnny were at home with Dorothy, and for once, Ellie moved without the tug of little hands at her skirts. Inside the store, a small crowd of women had already gathered, sifting through bolts of cloth and chatting as they always did. As Ellie joined the line, she noticed the glances again, quick, sideways looks, some tinged with pity, others with something harder, sharper, almost smug. She tried to ignore it, pretending to study the patterns in the fabric. But the air was heavy with unspoken words. It was Nadine, the most outspoken of the group, who finally broke the silence. She leaned in, lowering her voice, though not enough to keep it private. "Ellie, you mean to tell me you don't know?" Ellie blinked, unsure what Nadine was implying. Her voice came out hesitant. "Know what?" The other women shifted uncomfortably, some turning away, others suddenly fascinated with the fabric in their hands. Nadine pressed on, almost incredulous. "Mike. You're Mike. He's been spending his evenings with Stephanie Monroe. Half the town's seen it. You really didn't know." The words struck Ellie like a blow. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She shook her head, as if that might undo what she had just heard. "No, that's not. He's been with friends, with family," Nadine scoffed, but another woman, Kinder, tried to hush her. "That's enough, Nadine. Can't you see she's shaken?" But it was too late. The damage had been done. Ellie's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the counter, her vision blurring. She couldn't bear the weight of their stares, pity, judgment, triumph, all tangled together. Without another word, she turned and fled the store, leaving the fabric and the murmurs behind. By the time she reached home, tears were streaming down her face. She stumbled through the doorway, her sobs breaking loose unrestrained. Collapsing onto the floor, she wept openly, her cries filling the quiet house. Vera and Johnny, startled by the sound, clung to her sides, frightened by a grief they couldn't understand. Dorothy hurried in from the kitchen, her heart lurching at the sight of her daughter-in-law undone. "Ellie, child, what's happened?" she demanded, her voice sharp with worry. Through sobs, Ellie forced out the words, jagged and broken. "Mike, he's with her. With Stephanie. Everyone knows." For a long moment, Dorothy said nothing. Her lined face tightened, her eyes darkening as the truth settled heavy in the room. Finally, she knelt beside Ellie, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Hush now. Don't let the children see you torn apart like this." Ellie buried her face against Dorothy's shoulder, her sobs muffled. "What am I supposed to do? I love him, but I can't." Dorothy held her firmly, her voice steady in contrast to Ellie's trembling. "Listen to me. If it's true, then Mike has shamed himself, not you. You hear me? You are not the one who should hang her head." Ellie shook as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "How do I face him? How do I go on?" Dorothy stroked her hair with a hand worn from years of work. "You will face him because you must. For Vera. For Johnny. And you will not let him see you broken. Not yet. If he wants to speak of leaving, then let him say it to my face in this house. Until then, you hold your head high." The words, firm and unwavering, were like an anchor in a storm. Ellie clung to them, even as her heart split with betrayal. The picture of the perfect family had cracked, and no matter how tightly she tried to hold it together, she knew nothing would ever be the same again. Mike came home later than usual that evening, the November air clinging cold and sharp to his coat as he stepped into the house. The children were already in bed, their small breaths rising and falling in the quiet of the back room. Ellie sat at the table, her hands pressed flat against the wood as if holding herself together. Dorothy was near the stove, her eyes following her son with a steadiness that betrayed nothing. Mike didn't bother with pleasantries. He closed the door behind him, exhaled hard and said, "It's true. You've heard it already, I'm sure. I'm with Stephanie. I love her." The words seemed to slice the air in two. Ellie's lips parted, but no sound came. She stared at him, searching for some trace of the man she had built her life with, but all she saw was resolve carved into his face. "I don't want to sneak around anymore," he continued, his tone flat, almost businesslike. "You should pack your things. Take the kids and go back to your folks. I'll be bringing her here. Her house isn't fit for much. This one makes more sense. Don't worry, I'll provide for the kids. I won't abandon them." Ellie's chest tightened, the words slamming against her like blows. Go. Leave. With her children. From the home where she had made every meal, stitched every curtain, marked every inch of their growth on the doorframe. It felt impossible. Before Ellie could find her voice, Dorothy's chair scraped sharply against the floor. She stood, her back straight, her gaze fixed on her son. "This house is mine, Michael. My name's on the deed, not yours. And if you think for 1 second that I'll allow you to throw out Ellie and the children, you've lost your mind." Mike's face flushed, anger flaring. "Ma, don't start. You don't understand. I understand more than you think." Dorothy cut him off, her voice iron steady. "You've shamed your wife and broken your vows. And now you think you can just march her out and bring another woman in under my roof? Over my dead body." He took a step toward her, jaw tight. "You can't control everything. I have a right to my own life." Dorothy's eyes didn't waver. "You had a life, a family, and you're throwing it away. But if you want to leave, that's your choice. What you don't get to do is destroy what remains for the rest of us. Ellie and the children stay. You go." For a moment, the house was still, save for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Mike's hands clenched and unclenched, his anger colliding with the unmovable force of his mother's will. Then, slowly, his shoulders dropped, and he turned toward the door. Ellie watched him, her breath caught in her throat. Part of her wanted to cry out, to beg him not to go, but another part, the part bruised by betrayal, kept her silent. Tears pooled in her eyes, spilling over as she gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Mike looked back once, his expression unreadable. Then he left, the door shutting behind him with a finality that echoed through the room. Ellie's body sagged, her strength draining all at once. She covered her face with her hands, sobs breaking free, muffled but raw. "How do I live without him?" she whispered, her voice fractured. "I love him, Ma. I can't stop, even now." Dorothy moved to her side, lowering herself into the chair beside her. She wrapped an arm around Ellie, drawing her close. "You'll live because you must," she said softly but firmly. "For Vera. For Johnny. They need you more than he does. You hear me? You're stronger than you think." Ellie leaned into her mother-in-law's embrace, her tears soaking the older woman's shoulder. In that moment, Dorothy wasn't just a mother-in-law. She was the anchor that kept Ellie from sinking entirely. The Harrington home was quieter that night than it had ever been. But beneath the silence lay the weight of a family torn apart and the fragile determination of a woman who had no choice but to keep standing. The morning after Mike's departure, Ellie woke to a silence that felt heavier than the night before. His boots no longer rested by the door. His jacket no longer hung on the hook. The absence was everywhere, sharp and undeniable. Yet, even in that emptiness, life pressed forward. The children needed breakfast, the fire needed tending, and Dorothy's steady presence reminded Ellie that standing still was not an option. Within days, Ellie made a decision. She would return to work at Township Hall. She had left her position years earlier when Vera was born, thinking her time was better spent at home. But now the house felt less like a sanctuary and more like a battlefield scarred by betrayal. Work, she thought, might offer her purpose again, a way to keep moving instead of collapsing. The township commissioner welcomed her back readily. He remembered her as precise, hardworking, and discreet, the kind of qualities every small-town office relied upon. "We're glad to have you again, Ellie," he said, sliding a stack of ledgers toward her on her first day. "There's always more paperwork than hands to deal with it." Settling back into the rhythm of clerical work was not easy. She had to relearn details, reacquaint herself with the flow of town business. But Ellie approached each task with determination. She filed permits, organized minutes from council meetings, balanced budgets, all with a quiet discipline that impressed her colleagues. For the first time in weeks, she felt the ground firm beneath her feet. At home, Dorothy took charge of the children without complaint. She walked Vera to school each morning, held Johnny's hand as they crossed the quiet streets, and in the afternoons, kept them busy with small chores and stories from her own youth. Vera grew fond of listening to her grandmother's tales of the old days in Ohio, while Johnny, still small, clung to Dorothy with surprising ease. Knowing they were safe with their grandmother allowed Ellie to breathe a little easier while she worked. Occasionally, an envelope would arrive in the mail or a folded check would be slipped under the door. Money for Mike. True to his word, he sent support regularly. Ellie, however, could not bring herself to use it. She placed each payment into a small wooden box, tucked away in her dresser drawer. Just the thought of spending money that came from him, the man who had betrayed her so openly, made her stomach turn. "You should use it," Dorothy told her more than once. "It's meant for the children. They're his responsibility too." Ellie only shook her head. "I can't, Dorothy. Not yet. Not like this. We'll manage." And manage they did. It wasn't easy, but Ellie made sure her children were clothed and fed, that the house was kept warm, and that birthdays were still celebrated with small cakes and handmade gifts. The work at Township Hall provided just enough stability to keep the family afloat. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, Ellie often sat at the kitchen table with a lamp casting a warm glow across the paperwork she had brought home. Sometimes her eyes would blur with exhaustion, but she pressed on. There was no other choice. Strength, she realized, was not something she could wait for. It was something she had to summon daily, piece by piece. Neighbors watched her with a mix of sympathy and admiration. Some whispered about Mike, about his affair with Stephanie Monroe, shaking their heads at the disgrace of it all. But when it came to Ellie, the whispers softened. "She's tougher than she looks," they would say. "She's doing right by those children." For Ellie, praise from neighbors mattered little. What mattered was tucking her children into bed each night, seeing their small faces relax into sleep, knowing they felt safe. That knowledge gave her the will to keep going, even when grief threatened to pull her under. Each day that passed, the picture of the perfect family she once clung to felt further away. But something else took its place, resolve. Ellie might not have chosen this life, this betrayal, this sudden demand to stand alone. Yet she was proving day by day that she could. December settled over the town with its gray skies and biting winds, the kind of cold that pressed through coats and seemed to still everything in its path. For weeks, Ellie had gone about her days with a rhythm that was steady but joyless. Work at Township Hall, tending to the children, keeping the household afloat. The thought of Christmas filled her with a dull ache. Mike had always been the one to cut the tree, the one who carried it proudly into the house, the children trailing behind him in excitement. This year, she braced herself for a holiday that would feel empty. But on a frosted afternoon, just days before Christmas, there was a knock at the door. When Ellie opened it, Mike stood on the porch, his breath clouding in the cold air, his eyes downcast but hopeful. Behind him, Vera and Johnny rushed to his side, their faces lighting up in an instant. "Daddy, can we go pick the tree?" Johnny asked, his small hand tugging at Mike's coat. Mike glanced at Ellie, waiting. For a long moment, she said nothing, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Then, with a nod that felt both reluctant and inevitable, she answered softly, "Go ahead. Just make sure they're bundled up warm." The children squealed with delight as Mike led them to his truck. They drove to a local tree farm, rows of evergreens dusted with snow stretching across the hillside. Vera skipped ahead, pointing at the tallest tree she could find, while Johnny insisted on something short and fat. Mike laughed with them, crouching down to negotiate a choice. For a little while, it was as if nothing had broken between them, as if the months of silence and betrayal had been only a dream. When they returned, the children burst through the door, cheeks flushed, dragging the chosen tree behind them with Mike's help. The living room filled with the scent of pine as Mike set it upright in the stand. Boxes of ornaments came out from storage, each one carrying memories. Vera's paper angel from preschool, Johnny's painted handprint star, the glass baubles Ellie had bought in better years. Together, they decorated, the children's laughter echoing through the house. Dorothy watched from her chair, her eyes misty, while Ellie handed ornaments to Vera and Johnny, her movements deliberate, her smile thin but present. When the last ornament was hung and the garland of popcorn draped around the branches, they stood back to admire the tree. It glowed with the soft light of colored bulbs, a scene so familiar it nearly broke Ellie's heart. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Ellie lingered by the tree. Mike was there too, adjusting one of the ornaments, his face softened by the glow. For a moment, their eyes met. She looked away quickly, but not before he caught the flicker of emotion she tried to hide, the blend of longing and pain that lived side by side inside her. In the days that followed, Mike began to appear more often. At first, it was small gestures, bringing firewood, fixing the squeaky hinge on the back door, mending a broken step on the porch. Then it became routine, suppers shared with the children, evenings spent by the fire, the quiet hum of a man trying to carve his way back into the life he had abandoned. Dorothy said little, though her watchful eyes missed nothing. She let him help, let him tuck the children into bed, but she did not forget the hurt he had caused. Neither did Ellie. And yet, there were nights when the weight of exhaustion pressed down on her, and she did not protest when he stayed. Slowly, his clothes began to reappear in the drawers, his boots by the door once more. To outsiders, it might have seemed that the Harringtons were whole again. But inside Ellie's chest, the wound had not healed. She smiled when she had to, laughed with the children, even sat at the table beside Mike. But the memory of betrayal lingered, sharp as glass beneath the surface. They were together, yes, but not as they once had been. The house was warm, the tree was beautiful, the laughter of the children was real. Yet behind Ellie's eyes lived a quiet ache, a reminder that trust, once broken, does not mend so easily. It was a damp afternoon in early spring when Ellie saw her. The sky hung low with gray clouds, the air heavy with the smell of thawing earth. Ellie had just returned from Township Hall, her arms full of files she intended to review at home. As she reached the gate, she noticed a figure standing on the sidewalk, just beyond the fence. Stephanie Monroe. Her once bright face was pale, almost hollow, and her frame looked frail beneath a worn coat. She clutched the fabric close around her, as if the simple act of holding it together could keep her from breaking apart. When she raised her head, her eyes were sunken, ringed with exhaustion. Ellie froze. She had imagined this moment countless times, playing out the words she might spit at the woman who had shattered her family. But the reality was different. There was no smugness in Stephanie's expression, no trace of triumph. Only desperation. "Ellie," Stephanie said, her voice raw, almost hoarse. She stepped forward, fingers trembling as she caught the edge of Ellie's sleeve. "Please, I need to talk to you." Ellie's instinct was to recoil, to pull away, to retreat inside the house and slam the door. "We have nothing to say to each other," she replied coldly, her words clipped. But Stephanie fell to her knees, right there in the mud of the roadside, her hands clutching at the hem of Ellie's coat. "Please," she begged. "I can't go on like this. I'm carrying his child, Mike's child, and I know," her voice cracked, "I know you haven't forgiven him. I can feel it. So why won't you let him go? Why keep him when he still belongs to me?" The words pierced through Ellie, sharp and cruel in their honesty. For a moment, anger surged in her chest, but then she saw it, the way Stephanie's hands shook, the way her body sagged as if it no longer had the strength to hold her upright. She wasn't fighting to win anymore. She was clinging to survival. Ellie's lips tightened. "I didn't take anything from you. You're the one who destroyed a family. And if Mike came back, it was his choice, not mine." Stephanie's face twisted with anguish. She released Ellie's coat, covering her face with her hands. Then, without warning, she pushed herself to her feet and staggered toward the riverbank that ran just beyond the edge of town. Ellie's heart jolted. "Stephanie, stop!" she shouted, dropping the files in her arms and hurrying after her. But Stephanie kept walking, her pace unsteady, her shoulders hunched as if she were already surrendering to the weight of the world. She reached the edge of the river, the water swollen and rushing fast from recent rains. Standing there, she looked back once, her eyes glassy, distant. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. "Not for me. Not for this baby. Better to end it now." "No." Ellie screamed, closing the distance in a rush. But Stephanie had already stepped forward, her body lurching toward the current. Without a thought, Ellie leapt after her. The water was shockingly cold, searing her lungs as it closed over her head. She fought to surface, gasping, searching frantically until she spotted Stephanie's coat just below the waterline. With all her strength, Ellie grabbed hold, dragging her upward. "Hold on!" Ellie shouted, though Stephanie was limp in her arms, her eyes fluttering shut. Panic surged through Ellie as she kicked toward the bank, every stroke burning her muscles. The current pulled hard, but she pushed against it, fueled by something primal, an unwillingness to let this woman, even this woman, drown along with the life she carried. When at last she reached the muddy shore, Ellie dragged Stephanie onto the ground, her own chest heaving as she collapsed beside her. She fumbled with trembling hands, pressing down on Stephanie's chest, trying to force the water out. "Come on!" Ellie gasped, bending low to give her breaths, praying for a response. For agonizing seconds, there was nothing. Then Stephanie convulsed, water spilling from her mouth as she coughed violently, her body shuddering with the return of breath. Ellie sagged with relief, tears mixing with the river water dripping from her face. She pulled her phone from her soaked coat, hands shaking as she dialed 911. Her voice cracked as she spoke into the receiver. "This is Eleanor Harrington. I'm at the riverbank off County Road. A woman is pregnant and nearly drowned. Please send help now." Minutes later, the wail of sirens broke through the damp air. An EMS crew hurried down the bank, their boots sinking into the mud as they knelt beside Stephanie. They worked swiftly, checking her vitals, wrapping her in blankets, strapping her to a stretcher. Ellie stood back, shivering, arms wrapped around herself. Her body ached, but she couldn't look away as they lifted Stephanie. The paramedic glanced at her and nodded. "You saved her, and probably the baby too. We'll take it from here." Ellie only nodded faintly, her throat too tight for words. As the ambulance doors closed, she felt a wave of exhaustion crash over her. She had gone into the river chasing a woman she once thought she hated, and somehow emerged with something she didn't expect, a heart still capable of mercy, even when broken. 2 days after the river incident, Ellie could not silence the thought that she should check on Stephanie. She told herself it was out of responsibility, perhaps even curiosity, but deep down she knew it was more than that. She wanted closure, something to confirm that the act of saving her rival's life had meaning. She drove to the county hospital, its pale brick building looming against the cloudy sky. Inside, the scent of disinfectant and the muted echo of voices filled the halls. She asked the nurse at the front desk where Stephanie Monroe was staying. The woman glanced at the chart and nodded toward the second floor. Ellie's steps were slow, her breath tight as she moved down the hallway. She pushed open the door to the maternity ward, the sound of monitors beeping softly around her. Then she saw them. Mike sat by Stephanie's bed, his hand wrapped gently around hers. His posture was tender, protective, the posture of a man who had never left, who had never strayed from her side. Stephanie, pale but smiling faintly, looked at him as though he were her entire world. For Ellie, the sight was a knife through the chest. The air seemed to vanish from the room. She stood frozen in the doorway, her pulse thundering in her ears. This was the man who had come back to her table, who had eaten supper with their children, who had tucked them into bed as though trying to reclaim his place. And here he was, offering the same gentleness, the same devotion, to the woman who had torn their family apart. Ellie turned abruptly, the sound of her shoes echoing too loudly against the tile. She hurried down the hall, out through the hospital doors, her vision blurred by tears she could no longer hold back. By the time she returned home, her sorrow had hardened into something sharper. She marched into the bedroom, pulling Mike's shirts from the dresser, his boots from the corner, his shaving kit from the bathroom shelf. Each item landed in a growing pile on the floor, her hands moving faster, fueled by fury. At last she dragged an old duffel bag from the closet and began stuffing everything inside. Dorothy entered, alarmed at the noise. "Ellie, what are you?" She stopped short when she saw the pile of Mike's belongings. "He's gone," Ellie said, her voice trembling but resolute. "This time he's gone for good. I saw him at the hospital, sitting by her bed, holding her hand as if—" her voice broke, but she forced the words out, "as if I never existed." Dorothy's face tightened, sorrow and anger mingling in her eyes. She moved closer, resting a hand on Ellie's shoulder. "Then you're right to send him away. A man can make mistakes, but when he keeps repeating them, forgiveness becomes weakness. You've already given him too many chances." Ellie paused, her chest heaving, her hands clutching the fabric of one of Mike's shirts. For a fleeting moment, memories flickered. The early days of their marriage, the laughter, the pride she once felt to be his wife. But the image from the hospital came crashing back, and the weight of betrayal snuffed out any trace of longing. By the time the duffel was zipped, her decision was sealed. Later that night, the sound of the front door opening announced Mike's return. He stepped inside, his eyes weary, his face drawn. Before he could speak, Ellie tossed the bag at his feet. "Take it. You don't live here anymore." "Ellie, listen," he began, his voice pleading. "No," she snapped, her voice sharper than she had ever heard it. "I'm done listening. Go to her, go to anyone. But you won't come back here. Not again." For a moment, silence pressed between them. Mike bent slowly, picking up the bag. His gaze shifted from Ellie to his mother, as if searching for support. But Dorothy's eyes were cold, her jaw set. "She's right, Michael," she said quietly. "You've burned this bridge too many times." Mike lowered his head, defeated. Without another word, he turned and stepped out into the night. From that moment, he no longer lived under Dorothy's roof. Instead, he found temporary shelter with his brother on the other side of town. The Harrington home, though still scarred, was his no more. Ellie stood at the window long after he had gone, her reflection blurred by tears. For the first time, her resolve felt final. There would be no more second chances, no more illusions of mending what could never be restored. The call came on a gray October morning, when the chill of autumn had settled over the town. Ellie was at Township Hall, sorting through stacks of permits, when the phone on her desk rang. She lifted the receiver, her heart quickening at the unfamiliar voice on the line. "Mrs. Harrington, this is County Hospital. We need to inform you of something regarding Stephanie Monroe. She passed away early this morning. Complications during childbirth, massive hemorrhage. We couldn't stop the bleeding." Ellie's hand gripped the receiver until her knuckles whitened. The voice droned on, explaining procedures, next steps, but all she heard was the single devastating fact. Stephanie was dead. The caller's tone shifted, becoming more clipped, more official. She delivered a baby boy, healthy, strong. But Ms. Monroe had no legal spouse, no listed next of kin. In cases like this, we're required to notify County Children's Services. The infant will be placed into protective custody unless the father can be verified. Ellie's lips parted, but no words came. She managed only a faint, "I'll pass it on." When she hung up, she sat in silence, staring at the papers on her desk without seeing them. That evening, she delivered the news to Mike. He was standing by his brother's garage, wiping grease from his hands when she approached. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the heaviness of the message. "She's gone, Mike. Stephanie didn't survive the birth, but the baby did." For a moment, Mike said nothing. His rag slipped from his hands, falling onto the dirt. His face drained of color, and he staggered back against the wall. "Gone," he whispered. No, that can't," his voice broke. "And the baby?" "A boy," Ellie said quietly. "They're holding him at the hospital until everything is sorted. They need you to come, to prove you're his father." The next day, Mike walked into the hospital with shoulders bowed as though carrying the weight of two lives, the one lost and the one just begun. Hospital staff explained the process with clinical detachment. Without a marriage certificate, without his name on the birth record, he had no legal claim yet. He signed an acknowledgement of paternity, AOP, his hand trembling as the pen scratched across the form. With that signature, the child became his, legally, irrevocably. When the nurse finally placed the infant in his arms, Mike's chest heaved with a sound that was half sob, half sigh. The baby was swaddled in a hospital blanket, his tiny fists clenched, his face scrunched with the effort of existence. Mike cradled him as though afraid he might shatter, his tears dripping onto the baby's soft cheek. "You're all that's left," he whispered, "and I swear I won't fail you." Meanwhile, County Children's Services confirmed the paperwork and closed their file. The child would not enter the system. He had a father now. The funeral for Stephanie was small, almost stark in its simplicity. She had no family nearby, no one to claim her except the community that had once gossiped about her. The local church stepped in, arranging flowers, offering hymns, and ensuring she was buried with dignity. A few neighbors attended, standing silently at the graveside. Ellie did not go. She stayed home with Vera and Johnny, her heart torn between sorrow for the young woman who had brought such pain and pity for the child she had left behind. Dorothy attended in her place, saying later that it had been quiet, respectful, without the weight of judgment that had once followed Stephanie in life. After the burial, Mike returned to the Harrington home carrying the baby in a car seat far too big for his tiny body. He paused on the porch, his duffel bag still at his brother's, his face lined with grief. In his arms, though, there was something new, a fragile hope. He introduced the baby to his mother first. Dorothy leaned close, her voice soft with wonder. "A boy," she murmured, lifting him gently. "He's beautiful, Mike." Mike swallowed hard. "I was thinking, Daniel, or James Jr. Something strong, something to carry him forward." Dorothy nodded, tears shimmering in her eyes. "Daniel suits him." As Mike stood there, watching his son stretch and squirm in his grandmother's arms, he felt both the crushing weight of loss and the faint spark of redemption. Stephanie was gone, but her child lived. And now it was his duty, his chance, to do what he had failed to do before: protect, nurture, and stand steady for the life that depended on him. The Harrington household, though fractured and bruised, now had a new presence within its walls, a tiny boy who represented both tragedy and possibility. And as night fell, the old house seemed to breathe differently, its silence broken by the soft cries of new life. When Mike finally returned to his mother's home with the infant in his arms, he stood at the threshold for a long time, as though uncertain whether he had the right to enter. Dorothy opened the door before he could knock. Her eyes went immediately to the small bundle cradled against his chest. "Ma," he said, his voice cracking, "this is Daniel. My boy. I don't know how to do this alone. Please help me." Dorothy reached out with hands that trembled from age but were steady in spirit. She took the baby carefully, lifting him into her arms as though he were made of glass. The child stirred, then settled, his tiny face pressed against her shoulder. Tears welled in Dorothy's eyes as she looked down at her grandson. "You don't have to ask," she whispered. "This is family, and family takes care of its own." Ellie had been standing in the doorway to the kitchen, silent. Her arms were folded, her body rigid as she watched the scene unfold. Every fiber in her told her to stay back, to keep the wall between herself and the man who had wounded her so deeply. And yet, when her eyes fell upon the infant, his small hands opening and closing, his soft breaths filling the quiet, something shifted. Mike turned toward her, his face etched with exhaustion. "Ellie, I can't ask forgiveness. I know I've destroyed what we had. But please, for him, for Daniel. He deserves better than me fumbling through this on my own." For a long moment, Ellie said nothing. Her silence pressed heavy in the room, broken only by the creak of the old floorboards and the baby's faint stirring. Dorothy's gaze flicked from son to daughter-in-law, waiting. At last, Ellie stepped forward. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she extended her arms. Dorothy hesitated only a second before placing the infant into them. The weight was lighter than Ellie expected, yet it rooted her in place. She looked down into the tiny face, into eyes barely open, lips twitching in sleep. A warmth rose in her chest, surprising in its strength. The baby was blameless. He bore no guilt for the sins of his father or the tragedy of his mother. He was simply life, new, fragile, demanding care. Ellie's eyes burned with sudden tears. She rocked gently, her body remembering motions from when Vera and Johnny were small. For the first time in months, she felt something close to peace. Mike watched, his throat tightening, but he did not move closer. He seemed to understand that this was not his moment. It was hers. As the evening deepened, the house filled with a quiet not of sorrow, but of renewal. Vera tiptoed in, curious, Johnny close behind her. Their eyes widened at the sight of the baby in their mother's arms. "Is he staying?" Vera whispered. Ellie glanced at them, then at Dorothy, who nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "He's family." The children edged closer, peering at their new half-brother with wonder. Johnny reached out, his finger brushing the baby's tiny fist. The infant stirred, grasping hold instinctively, and Johnny giggled. Ellie felt her lips curve into a small smile. For all the pain and betrayal, for all the tears she had shed, here was something she could not deny. Life had given them a new chapter, one she would not turn away from. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed and Dorothy had retreated to her room, Ellie sat in the old rocking chair in the corner of the living room. The baby rested against her chest, his breaths even and warm. The house was quiet, the only sound the gentle creak of the chair and the distant ticking of the clock. She looked down at him, brushing a strand of hair from her damp cheek. In a voice barely above a whisper, she murmured, "Sleep, little one. You're safe now. Mama's here." The word slipped out before she realized it, instinctive and unguarded, as though the baby were her own flesh and blood. And in that moment, something inside her softened, not for Mike, not for the man who had broken her, but for herself. She realized she was still capable of compassion, of love, even after all that had been taken from her. The picture-perfect family she once believed in was gone, but in its place stood something stronger, The quiet resilience of a woman who had been betrayed yet refused to let bitterness consume her, who could cradle the child of her husband's affair and still find it in her heart to nurture him. The Harrington home would never be the same, but perhaps Ellie thought it did not need to be. What mattered was this moment, the fragile life in her arms, the children asleep in their beds, the strength she had found within herself to endure. Because in the end, it was not Mike's choices that defined the family, nor the town's gossip, nor the wounds left behind. It was the unyielding strength, the compassion, and the quiet courage of a woman who refused to break. I used to think love would come quietly like a warm breeze on a spring morning, subtle and kind. But the day I met Adrian Blake, it came like a lightning strike. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind where exhaustion clings to you after a long day of lectures. I climbed onto the bus, juggling my backpack and an old canvas tote, eyes down, ready to zone out until my stop. "Here, take my seat," a deep voice said. I looked up. He stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal gray coat that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover, not on public transit. His smile was easy, warm, and disarming. "Thank you," I murmured, sliding into the seat. I expected him to pull out his phone and ignore me, but he stayed near, holding the rail, his eyes flicking to me with curiosity. "You don't look like you're from around here," he said lightly, almost cautious. I blinked, a little surprised. "I'm a student. University of Texas, languages major." "That explains it," he said, studying me just long enough to make me feel noticed, but not uncomfortable. Confident, but cautious. "Sorry, that probably sounds strange." I smiled despite myself. A little. He laughed softly, and it was warm, genuine, like he actually cared what I thought. We talked all the way to my stop about nothing really. Coffee shops, favorite parks, how Texas weather couldn't decide if it wanted to be summer or winter. When the bus hissed to a stop, I stood, ready to disappear back into my normal, quiet life. But he called out, "Wait, can I get your number? I'd like to see you again." Normally, I would have said no. I wasn't the type to hand my number to a stranger. But something in the way he looked at me, like I was the only person on that bus, made me nod. Sure. The very next night, I found myself standing outside a restaurant I had no business being in. The kind of place with soft golden lighting, sleek cars lined up at the valet, and a maitre d' who looked at you like they already knew your credit score. I hesitated, smoothing my simple black dress, and then Adrian appeared, smiling like I was exactly who he wanted to see. "You look incredible," he said, kissing the back of my hand like some old-world gentleman. Dinner with him felt like stepping into another life. He ordered wine I couldn't pronounce and told me stories about growing up in Europe, about his adoptive parents, Robert and Helena DuPont, who lived mostly in Paris and Geneva, traveling between art shows and charity events. He said he returned to Texas because he wanted to reconnect with his roots. I listened, fascinated. He wasn't bragging. He just shared, like someone who trusted me with pieces of himself. And when he asked about me, my classes, my family, my dreams, he actually listened. By the time he walked me to my car, I realized something strange. I wanted to see him again. From then on, we were inseparable. Study sessions turned into coffee dates turned into weekend hikes, and weekend hikes turned into late-night phone calls that stretched until dawn. Adrian had this way of making me feel like I mattered, like I wasn't just another college student grinding through assignments and part-time work. He'd text me good morning before my alarm went off and good night long after I'd fallen asleep. He made me laugh when I was stressed, brought me coffee on days I didn't think I could handle one more lecture, and once showed up at my apartment with flowers just because. It wasn't long before he started talking about the future. "You should meet my parents," he said one evening as we sat on the balcony of his downtown condo, the city lights glowing beneath us. "They'll love you. They've always wanted me to find someone special." I blinked, caught off guard by how fast everything was moving, but in a good way. "Are you sure? I mean, we've only been dating for long enough," he cut in with a grin. "Trust me, Sarah, you're different." No one had ever said that to me before, not like that. And I realized then how much I liked hearing it. For the first time in years, I let myself believe I could have a love that was safe and maybe even lasting. Before Adrian came along, my life was simple, maybe too simple. I grew up in a small town just outside Austin, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and most of your business. My childhood wasn't perfect, but it was honest and a little hard at times. My mom, Patricia, though everyone calls her Patty, was the kind of woman who could stretch $1 like magic. She worked long hours at the local grocery store, stocking shelves, running the register, doing whatever it took to keep food on our table. My dad left when I was 7. There were no phone calls, no birthday cards, just absence, like someone had cut a hole in our lives and left it there. Mom never said a bad word about him, but I could see how her eyes hardened whenever someone mentioned his name. She didn't have the luxury of bitterness. She had 2 daughters to raise, and she did it on her own. Then there was Jenna, my older sister by 3 years. She used to be my hero, confident, graceful, unstoppable. Jenna was a dancer, and not just any dancer. She was winning competitions, getting invited to regional showcases, and talking about moving to New York one day. Watching her perform was like watching someone fly. Then came the accident. A rainy evening, a slick road, and a driver who couldn't stop in time changed everything. Jenna's left leg took most of the impact. The doctors saved it, but her career, it was gone. She tried for months to push through, to keep dancing despite the pain, but eventually she quit. And then her fiancé left. He said all the right things. It's not you, it's me, and I just can't handle seeing you like this. But the truth was simpler. He didn't want a life with someone who couldn't dance anymore. Jenna retreated into herself after that. She stopped performing, stopped dating, stopped living in a way. Some days she was okay, joking and chatting like old times, but most days she stayed in her room with headphones on, pretending the world outside didn't exist. I think watching her go through that is what made me cautious about relationships. I told myself I was focusing on school, on working toward a degree in Spanish language and literature, but deep down I was just scared. Scared of giving someone that kind of power over me. Still, there was a part of me that longed for something real. Not just a fling, not just a boyfriend, but someone who saw me, who stayed. That's probably why Adrian felt like such a miracle. He stepped into my life with his easy smile and warm voice, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel weighed down by everything I'd seen go wrong. Mom noticed before anyone else. One Sunday, she set down her mixing spoon and stared at me. "You're smiling more lately," she said, half accusing, half teasing. "Is there a boy involved?" I wanted to deny it like I usually did when she pried, but instead I laughed and nodded. "Yeah, Mom, there's someone." She studied me for a long moment, like she was weighing whether to be happy or worried. Finally, she sighed and said softly, "Just promise me one thing, Sarah. Take care of your heart. It's worth more than you know." At the time, I thought she was just being protective. I didn't know how right she was. When Adrian invited me to dinner with his parents, I was nervous but also excited. Meeting someone's family meant something. It meant we weren't just casually dating anymore. It meant he was serious. "They're a little different," he said with a grin as he steered his car through winding roads. "Grew up in France, lived all over Europe. You'll like them." That word, different, echoed in my head all day. My roommate, Emily, gave me a strange piece of advice before I left. If they speak French, pretend you don't understand it. People say things when they think you can't follow along. I almost laughed. "Emily, I'm not fluent. I only took beginner French for my language elective." "Exactly. Don't let them know you understand even a little," she said, wagging a finger. "Just smile and nod. Trust me." So that's what I decided to do. The DuPont home looked like something out of an architectural magazine. Sleek modern lines softened by warm lighting, with framed European art lining the walls. Helena DuPont greeted us at the door, a tall, elegant woman with silver-streaked hair swept back into a perfect bun. Robert, her husband, followed, quiet but with an assessing look in his eyes that made me sit a little straighter. Bienvenue, Helena said warmly, kissing Adrian on both cheeks before turning to me. And you must be Sarah. I smiled, murmuring hello. Adrian quickly added, She mostly speaks English, Mom. Helena's smile softened, but something in her eyes flickered. Interest? Amusement? I couldn't tell. We sat at a long oak table set like a painting. Polished silverware, crystal glasses, flickering candles. At first, everything felt almost perfect. Helena asked polite questions about school and family. Robert nodded along, occasionally adding a short comment. Adrian kept one hand resting lightly on mine, as if to remind me I belonged there. But then, midway through dessert, Helena glanced at her husband and switched to French. Elle voit smooth, deliberate. Elle ne sait pas pourquoi nous avons besoin d'elle, n'est-ce pas? She doesn't know why we need her, does she? My breath caught, but I kept my face blank, pretending I hadn't understood a word. Adrian answered quickly, also in French. Non, elle ne sait rien. No, she doesn't know a thing. Helena smiled faintly, taking another sip of wine, and turned the conversation back to English, complimenting my dress as if nothing unusual had happened. I forced a polite smile, but inside my heart was pounding. Need me? For what? The rest of dinner passed in a blur. I nodded when I was supposed to, smiled when it felt right, all while replaying those French words in my mind over and over. On the drive back, Adrian was cheerful, asking me what I thought of his parents. They're very sophisticated, I said carefully. He chuckled. Yeah, they can be intimidating. Don't take it personally. They've just lived in a different world for so long. I nodded, staring out the window, but I couldn't shake that feeling, like I'd just stepped into something I didn't understand. That night, lying in bed, I whispered the words I'd overheard under my breath. She doesn't know why we need her. Whatever that meant, it wasn't about love or acceptance or family. It was about me being useful to them somehow. And for the first time since I'd met Adrian, a cold thread of fear slipped through the warmth I felt for him. 2 weeks after that dinner, Adrian surprised me with an idea. Let's get away this weekend, he said, leaning casually against my kitchen counter. Just you and me. I booked a cabin out in the hill country. You could use a break. We both could. On the surface, it sounded perfect, quiet, romantic, far from school stress, and the echo of Helena's words still stuck in my head. I hesitated, but Adrian noticed and cupped my face gently. You've been tense lately. Let me take care of you for once. I nodded slowly. Okay, yeah, that sounds nice. The drive itself was beautiful. Rolling hills, wildflowers swaying in the warm Texas wind, and Adrian humming softly to the radio. He seemed completely at ease, like this was just another step in our relationship. I wanted to believe it. When we arrived, I stepped out and blinked at the view. The cabin looked like something from a travel magazine. Wood and stone wraparound porch, and beyond it, a shimmering lake reflecting the golden evening sun. Pretty amazing, huh? Adrian said, slipping an arm around my waist. Come on, let's unpack and start dinner. Inside, the place was even more luxurious. Fireplace, soft rugs, a kitchen already stocked. Adrian opened a bottle of red wine and poured me a glass. To us, he said with a warm smile. We talked, we laughed, we cooked together, and for a while I forgot about that nagging voice in my head. Until I noticed how often he refilled my glass. By the time I sat down, my head felt light. Adrian, I feel tired. My words came out thick, my vision tilting. He was by my side in an instant, lowering me gently onto the couch. Shoot, just rest, he whispered, his voice calm and oddly distant. I woke up to the smell of damp wood and something metallic. My head throbbed, and my hands wouldn't move. They were tied behind me. I was on a cold concrete floor in what looked like a basement. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then I heard Adrian's voice, calm and deliberate, from somewhere above. Yeah, she's ready. Everything's in place. A chill shot down my spine. She's ready? Ready for what? I twisted my wrists, wincing as the ropes cut into my skin. Adrian, what are you doing? My voice cracked, panicked. He appeared at the top of the stairs, descending slowly, his expression soft, almost tender but wrong. Sarah, you don't understand now, but you will. This is going to change your life. My heart pounded, so hard I thought I might pass out. Untie me. Adrian, please. Whatever this is, it isn't funny. He crouched in front of me, brushing a strand of hair from my face. She'd trust me. Soon you'll thank me. And in that moment, staring at the man I thought I loved, I knew two things. He wasn't who I thought he was, and if I didn't get out, I might never get home again. The ropes dug into my wrists, burning with every movement, but I didn't care. Panic sharpened everything. My breathing, the cold floor beneath me, even the faint hum of crickets outside. Adrian's voice drifted from upstairs. Calm. Steady. Yeah, she's ready. Everything's in place, no. She doesn't suspect a thing. My stomach twisted. She's ready? For what? I looked around the basement. A single dangling bulb cast pale light over the concrete walls. There, a rusty nail sticking from an old wooden doorframe. I shifted, inching toward it on my knees, praying the ropes didn't snap loud enough for him to hear. My pulse throbbed in my ears as I began rubbing the ropes against the nail. At first, nothing. Then a strand gave way. Then another, until one hand slipped free. I froze, listening. Adrian was still talking upstairs. I untied the rest with trembling fingers, then moved to my ankles. My hands were slick with sweat, but finally the ropes fell away. The stairs were too risky. I turned to the small window near the ceiling. It was tight, but I shoved it open and crawled through, scraping my arms on the rough frame. Cold night air hit my face as I fell to the ground outside. I ran. Branches whipped my arms and face as I tore through the woods. Behind me, a shout split the night. Sarah, stop. It's not what you think. I didn't stop. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I kept running. Every snapping branch sounded like his footsteps closing in. Then, ahead, a light, faint but real. A cabin. I sprinted toward it, tripping on a root and hitting the ground hard before scrambling up again. Help! I screamed, pounding on the door. Please help me. The door swung open, and a man filled the frame, tall, broad, wearing a gray hoodie. Beside him, a Belgian Malinois growled low, muscles coiled to spring. What's going on? He demanded, eyes narrowing. Someone, he drugged me. Tied me up, he's coming, please. My voice cracked as tears spilled down my face. The man didn't hesitate. He stepped aside, pulling me in and snapping a command. Duke, watch! The dog bolted out, barking fiercely into the night. From somewhere behind us, Adrian cursed and retreated into silence. The man slammed the door, locking it. You're safe now, he said firmly, scanning me from head to toe. You're shaking. Sit down. I collapsed onto a worn leather chair, my body trembling uncontrollably as adrenaline drained out of me. Who tied you up? He asked, kneeling to look at the rope burns on my wrists. My boyfriend. Adrian Blake, I stammered. He's not who I thought he was, he said. He was helping me. But my voice trailed off as the reality hit me. I had trusted the wrong person, and it had nearly cost me everything. The man's jaw tightened. Name's Mark Bennett. I live out here, ex-army, now search and rescue. You're safe here. Thank you, I whispered, tears spilling again. First things first, we call the sheriff. He grabbed his phone and dialed, speaking quickly, efficiently. When he finished, he handed me a blanket and crouched beside me again. You're okay now. Whatever he planned, it's over. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Adrian had a reason for what he did, and until I knew what it was, I wouldn't feel truly free. The deputies arrived 20 minutes later. By then, my mom and sister had shown up too. Mark had called them when I couldn't form words. Mom wrapped me in her arms so tight I could barely breathe. You're safe now, baby, she whispered. But even as I clung to her, one thought kept echoing. Why did they need me? I didn't have an answer, yet the sheriff's office felt colder than the night outside. A deputy wrapped a blanket around my shoulders as I sat under the harsh, fluorescent lights, trying to keep my breathing steady. "Take your time, Miss Mitchell," one officer said gently. "Start from the beginning." So I did every detail. Meeting Adrian, falling in love, dinner with his parents, the words in French I wasn't supposed to understand, and finally waking up tied in a basement. When I finished, there was a long silence. The lead investigator, Detective Harris, tapped his pen against his notebook. "You said you understood some French. What exactly did you hear?" I repeated it carefully. "She doesn't know why we need her, does she?" And Adrian's reply, "No, she doesn't know a thing." Harris exchanged a look with another deputy. "That tracks with some intel we've been piecing together." I frowned. "Intel? On what?" He leaned forward. "Adrian Blake isn't just a charming boyfriend. His adoptive parents, Robert and Helena DuPont, are under quiet investigation for international fraud." "Fraud?" My voice cracked. "They've been posing as humanitarian consultants, claiming to help wealthy families locate missing relatives. They charge millions, but in most cases, they don't actually find anyone. And when they do deliver someone," Harris's eyes met mine, steady and grave, "they deliver the wrong person. A look-alike." My stomach sank. "A look-alike like me." Harris nodded. "One of their clients is Viktor Ryabintsev, a billionaire who lost his young daughter years ago. Word is he's still desperate to find her, and willing to pay whatever it takes. Your resemblance to her? It's uncanny." The room tilted for a moment. "So Adrian, he never loved me." "He targeted you," Harris said bluntly. "Built trust, made sure you were emotionally invested, then planned to deliver you to Ryabintsev as his missing daughter. They would have faked enough documents to make it look real." A chill ran through me, so deep I felt like I'd never be warm again. By morning, deputies had swarmed the cabin where Adrian had taken me. They found the ropes, the sedative-laced wine, and a duffel bag full of forged paperwork, including a passport with my picture, but someone else's name. Robert and Helena were arrested at a small private airfield, attempting to board a plane bound for France. Adrian was caught hours later, hiding in an abandoned storage facility. When they brought him in, I was still at the station, giving a formal statement. He looked calm, almost resigned. "Sarah," he said softly as they let him past me in handcuffs, "you don't have to hate me. I was giving you a better life." I stared at him, stunned. "You call that a better life? Drugging me? Lying to me? Selling me like I'm property?" For the first time, a flicker of something crossed his face, maybe shame, maybe regret. But it was gone in an instant as they took him away. The FBI became involved within days. It turned out this wasn't the first time the DuPonts had tried something like this. They had executed similar scams in Europe, swapping in lookalikes for missing heirs. Most victims had been too embarrassed or too traumatized to come forward. But I wasn't going to be silent. I gave my statement to anyone who needed it. I sat through endless hours of interviews and depositions, and each time I spoke, I felt like I was clawing back a piece of myself that Adrian had tried to steal. Still, the nights were hard. I'd wake up gasping, thinking I was still in that basement, still tied down, still listening to Adrian's voice telling me I'd thank him later. Mark Bennett, the man who saved me, stopped by often just to check in. Sometimes he didn't even say much, just sat on the porch with me while Duke, his Belgian Malinois, lay at our feet. Somehow, that quiet company made it easier to breathe. I was free, but I still didn't feel safe. Not yet. The weeks after Adrian's arrest blurred together. I was safe, but safety didn't feel the way I thought it would. Every night, I jolted awake, convinced I was still in that basement, still hearing his voice whisper, "You'll thank me later." Mom tried to help in the only way she knew how, by cooking. Every time I turned around, there was another casserole in the fridge or a fresh pie cooling on the counter. Jenna tried too, awkwardly at first, but she slowly began opening up about her own pain. "You didn't deserve that," she told me one afternoon, her eyes glossy. And I didn't deserve what happened to me either. Maybe we both have to stop blaming ourselves for what other people did. Her words stuck with me, but it was Mark who helped me begin to breathe again. He showed up at my porch one evening, Duke trotting happily by his side. "Thought I'd check in," he said, scratching the dog's ears. "See how you're holding up." I shrugged, unable to hide how tired I felt. Some days are fine, some not so much. Mark nodded like he understood more than I could put into words. "That's normal. Healing isn't neat. It's messy and it's slow. And that's okay." His voice carried a weight of experience I hadn't noticed before. Eventually, he told me why. For years earlier, his wife and young daughter had died in a car accident. He'd left the army after that and moved out to the hill country, choosing solitude over anything else. "I couldn't stand people looking at me like I was broken," he admitted one night as we walked Duke near the lake. "So I came out here where nobody knew me." I looked at him, realizing he understood what it meant to feel safe and unsafe at the same time, to want connection but fear it. Over the next few weeks, we talked more. Sometimes about big things, grief, trust, starting over, and sometimes about small things like which coffee shop had the best cinnamon rolls. But every conversation felt safe. Mark didn't try to fix me. He didn't tell me to smile or move on. He just let me be. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting everything gold, Mark said something that stopped me in my tracks. "You're stronger than you think. You didn't just survive, Sarah. You ran, you fought, you got yourself out. That's grit most people never find." I swallowed hard. "I don't feel strong." "You don't have to feel it to be it," he said softly. In time, we found ways to help each other. He encouraged me to take long walks again, without panicking at every snapping branch, and I encouraged him to reconnect with people, to let someone in again. Then came an unexpected twist. With help from Mark's old army contacts, we located Viktor Ryabintsev's real missing daughter, Julia. Watching father and daughter reunite after decades apart was overwhelming, not just for them, but for me. It reminded me that not everything ended in betrayal. Some things could still be good. That night, sitting on the porch with Mark and Duke, I felt something I hadn't felt since before Adrian. Peace. Mark handed me a cup of coffee and said quietly, almost shyly, "I like having you around." For the first time in a long time, I smiled a real smile. I like being around too. And in that moment, with Duke curled at our feet and the stars stretching endlessly above us, I realized something powerful. I wasn't scared anymore. Not of Mark, not of trusting someone new, and maybe not even of my own future. The seasons shifted as my life quietly rebuilt itself. What once felt like permanent darkness slowly warmed into something brighter, safer. Mark and I didn't rush anything, but somehow it still felt like we had been moving toward each other all along. He was patient, steady, the kind of man who let silence mean safety instead of awkwardness. One evening, Jenna stood in front of me, tears in her eyes without her crutches. "I got approved for the final phase of surgery," she said, voice trembling with joy. "It turned out Viktor Ryabintsev, grateful beyond words that we had helped reunite him with his real daughter, had paid for every procedure Jenna needed to dance again. The night before her surgery, Jenna took my hands and whispered, 'You saved me, Sarah. Without you, I'd still be hiding. You didn't just escape. You pulled me out of my own basement too.' I hugged her tightly, realizing healing was rarely just one person's journey. It rippled outward, touching everyone you loved. Months later, on a warm spring evening, Mark led me to the lake near his cabin. Duke bounded ahead, tail wagging, as if he knew something I didn't. "Sarah," Mark began, his voice carrying an edge of nervousness I'd never heard before. I spent years thinking my life was over. That love was something I'd already lost. But then you came banging on my door, terrified and brave all at once, and you woke me up. He pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple, elegant ring. I don't know what the future looks like, but I know I want to face it with you. Will you marry me? Tears blurred my vision as I whispered, yes. For a moment, everything stood still, the wind, the trees, even my own fear. Because in that moment, I wasn't broken. I was whole. We had a small wedding in Jenna's favorite dance studio, the one she had refused to step foot in for years. That day, she danced again, slow, careful, but radiant, with Mark and me watching through tears. And a month later, as Mark and I unpacked the last box in the small house he'd been building, I held a pregnancy test in my trembling hands. Positive. That night, I stood on our porch, staring at the stars over the Texas Hill Country, one hand resting on my stomach, and whispered, "We're okay now, we're safe." I had thought the world would always feel dangerous after what happened, that trust would always feel impossible. But I was wrong. Sometimes life breaks you open so something better can grow. And this life I almost lost was finally beautifully mine again.